Welcome everyone to this first lecture, which will be dedicated to the rise and fall, the rise and decline of feudalism in medieval Britain. So we'll talk about the period before the 16th century, which is what we'll be discussing in a week. There is usually one date in British history that British school kids remember, and that date is 1066. It's basically the equivalent of our own Marignan 1515, except that people actually usually know what it means, as opposed to Marignan 1515. Take a second to think about what it actually is, and I'm not sure you do. But by the end of the lesson, hopefully you'll know what 1066 is about. 1066 ushered in, or brought in, under the leadership of William, Duke of Normandy, and later on King of England, an era which saw the progressive institutionalization of the English and then the British constitutional system. And it started defining the politics of power in the British Isles. In this lecture, we'll therefore discover why the Norman conquests of 1066 was in any way significant. What we'll talk about, what we'll discuss basically, is the ways in which a struggle for power ensued between William's successors as kings of England and their own barons, which led to the adoption of Magna Carta and to the creation of the first modern English Parliament. In order to do this, what we'll do is discuss an important feature of the late medieval period, which is feudalism. So some of the keywords for today should appear on screen. Basically 1066, as you've gathered, William the Conqueror, Magna Carta, we'll discuss Parliament as well, and feudalism is also going to be key today. So let's take a look at the outline for today. We'll be discussing first the Norman conquest, that'll be point number one. Then we shall talk about the tensions between the kings and their barons, in particular one king. And eventually they'll take us to this very fun topic that you really want to hear about, which is the Black Death and another massive pandemic. Now, let's take a look at the place we'll be talking about, the British Isles. The British Isles were invaded several times between the 18th century BC, that is before Christ, and the 9th century. First you had the Celts, then the Romans, who gave the main island its name, Britannia. Then mainly the Angles and the Saxons that came from Eastern Europe. And finally the Vikings that came from Scandinavia. Those waves of invasion meant that the islands had long been divided into several and clearly defined, extremely small, politically unstable kingdoms. By the 9th century, Britain had come to be mainly divided between Anglo-Saxon rule, as you can see in the south, in the southeast, and Danelaw in the north, the Viking territories basically. What you need to remember, before 1066, there was no territorial unity, there was no political unity to speak of in the British Isles. That'll basically take us to the Norman conquest. And you can see on screen William looking absolutely badass, who invaded England, defeated his Anglo-Saxon rival at the Battle of Hastings, and became William I, King of England. Indeed, in 1066, the Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of the Vikings who had invaded the northern coastlines of what is now France, the Norsemen, if you think about it, he laid claim to the throne of England after the King of England, a relative of his, died. And there was basically this dynastic struggle with William and others saying, me, I'm the next king, and this rivalry eventually led to William invading successfully the island with his Norman army. He crushed his rival at the Battle of Hastings and was crowned William I. This was commemorated in this particular tapestry that you can see on screen, a tapestry that has been borrowed by the British. France has agreed to lend the tapestry to the UK, and you can see the Norman conquest in the age of Brexit on this particular cartoon. Now, the conquest had very long-lasting consequences, and this is what we're going to discuss just now. Indeed, the Normans brought with them what we now describe as the feudal system or feudalism. Remember one of the keywords that I mentioned earlier. Basically, you have to visualize, to imagine a pyramid. So let's take a look. Of course, at the very top of this pyramid, you've got the king. Underneath, the nobles, the great nobles, the barons that were responsible directly to the king. And then beneath them, you've got lesser lords, each owning a village, of course, directly responsible to a baron. Those were the vassals. Under those lesser lords were the peasants. They were tied by a strict system of duties, a strict system of obligations to the local lord, meaning that they owed allegiance to that person. And they were forbidden to travel without his permission, so they just simply couldn't go as they pleased. When William I invaded England, he gave small portions of each land he conquered to members of his army. What does it mean? That each landlord owned fragmented lands and could not easily rebel against the king and owed the king. It's like, okay, the king would... in a way, not directly, but tell them that they owed him, and they did. And it meant that it was also difficult to gather a large army from distant parts of the realms. Right, so to sum up, we have basically great power that has been conferred to the king. That being said, there was no absolute power to the king. Indeed, you had a system of allegiance in exchange for protection. To sum up, the pyramidal feudal system of the Normans basically meant that what you had was, this pyramid that I've shown you, with all fighting under the same leader, so a sense of unity, and that's different from the clanic system of the Anglo-Saxons, with different clans that you can see in this particularly badly framed PowerPoint slide for some reason, just to add to the spice of the lecture. So you've got each clan fighting for themselves and fighting against the text in the PowerPoint, which basically means that the military advantage was to that new system. It was a new per se, but that system that had been brought by the Normans. Now, this did not mean that the king had absolute power. In fact, the nobles only agreed to be loyal and to fight for the king if he gave them lands and the hereditary right to rule this land. This was the same between nobles and knights as well, the same kind of time. So there was no absolute power to the king whatsoever. There's an increase of power, but no absolute power per se. The Norman conquest was also fast, and it was also successful. William's promises of land to his followers, as well as the fragmentation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that you can see to the left, but that we also talked about just a second ago. This meant that the Norman conquest of England in between 1066 and until around 1072 was fast, and it was successful. What do we mean by that? Why successful? Well, to give you an idea of how successful that was, you had basically the fact that William's promises of land to his followers plus the fragmentation of the country led to around 95% of the lands taken from Anglo-Saxon lords and given to Norman lords, Norman nobles. This desire of the Norman kings for more control, more centralization of power rather than a fragmented situation, This can be witnessed as early as the 1080s, when King William I attempted to record the population and the value and ownership of lands in England with the Domesday Book. The idea was also to introduce a new fiscal system. Now you've got the word doom, which is basically the old English word for judgment. The survey being therefore likened to a sort of day of reckoning from which there was no appeal. The survey was completed in 1066. So to sum up, 1080s, Domesday Book, a census to estimate the value of the land for taxation. Doom basically is the sense that you just cannot escape the counting process, is that sense of doom. A feeling that has also become a little bit common these days, that feeling of doom. But let's not be overshadowed by doom. You can see here on screen an illustration that is taken from the Domesday Book. What is the point of it, and how did it look, and what language does it use? Latin. Why? Because rulers spoke French, we'll get back to that, and it was also the language of the church. What do we find out in the Domesday Book? I mean, if we wanted to read it, to take a look at it nowadays, what would we learn? And why is it interesting and fascinating? We would learn how people lived to an extent. We learned that there were few towns, that there were plenty of sheep, plenty of pigs. We learn who owned the lands. That was one of the points of the book. Only a handful of English people, and how wealthy the country was. To give you an idea, a total value of the land recorded was around £73,000, which of course would be laughable, well, not laughable today, it would be like a hefty sum, but may sound very little for what we're discussing, but actually meant that the country was wealthy. Now, this is important, but we should also mention that vassals had their independence of mind. They often disregarded the king, who did not have the individual means to control large territories. So in a way, you could say that they acted like kings in their own manners. What we should also point out is that the reality of power was local, not national. What does it mean? Maybe you're thinking, oh, what's going on there? What it means is that the armed protection of, there was armed protection of the local lord in exchange for allegiance, in exchange for service, in exchange for labor, in exchange for food or rents or taxes from the peasants. So basically what we have is a system that is a social organization as much as a political system. So when we talk about feudalism, we do not simply refer to a political organization, but a social system that relied a lot on local levels, on the local scale. That being said, the local lords, even though they could get allegiance from the peasants, they still needed the idea of the king's power to justify their own power to the peasants, to justify the power that they held over the peasants. Hence the ideology of a pyramidal, stratified society as a sort of natural order. And basically, this is something that has been referred to by O'Driscoll as the beginning of the English class system. So, if we discuss the expansion of Norman English power in the 12th and 13th century, what we notice is that, unsurprisingly, the authority of the English monarch gradually extended from the southeast of England to other parts of these islands over the next 250 years. Scotland remained independent, but had to fight several wars in order to do so. Just a little bit of a reference to these wars. Braveheart, which is a Hollywood film about William Wallace. Basically, it's not a film that I would recommend for its historical accuracy. That doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily watch it, but do not watch it thinking that you're learning accurate history there. So there were consequences, therefore, that were very much political, but that also had to do with local hierarchy. That being said, there are also consequences on culture. And what we see indeed is the birth of the modern English language, the language that you've learned to love and enjoy. The Norman conquest brought England into the mainstream of Western European culture. What does it mean? It means that before it was dominated by Saxon culture, by Scandinavian culture, it was sort of under their area of influence. Whereas with the Norman conquest, they become closer, if you will, to Western European culture. Norman nobles, as well as the king's court, spoke French, the language of the powerful. Versus the Anglo-Saxon common people, I don't like to use air quotes, but they're required here. The common people, they spoke a language of Germanic origins. Then what you have is a fusion of those two languages. So Norman nobles, kings, French, Anglo-Saxon, so-called common people, German origins, then fusion of the two, and we get towards modern English. These two layers of language are still apparent or still visible in modern English, where you often find two words to say the same thing. You can take a minute to think about this, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Check out that lovely creature on your screen. Sheep, but when you eat it, mutton, mouton. You can also, of course, think of words like liberty and freedom, liberté, rise and elevation, élévation, pig and pork, le porc, and of course, as I mentioned, sheep and mutton. The first words in the list, freedom, rise, pig, sheep, they're all closer to the everyday reality of the people, and the second ones tend to be more abstract. Only the Norman lords could afford to eat meat, for instance, so that explains that dichotomy. England also kept the Anglo-Saxon concept of common law and not Roman law as the basis of its legal system. Now, perhaps what you're wondering at this point is, what happens next? As long as there were lands to be conquered, there was unity of purpose between the king and his vassals. So what happened next is unity of purpose as long as there are lands to be conquered. But tensions are coming. Tensions between the king and his barons. So what we're doing right now is jumping ahead, sort of, grabbing a time machine or a TARDIS, for those who know what it is. If you don't know, forget it. Or don't forget it, find out. But focus on the tensions between the king and his barons in a period of history that we've moved all the way to, which is the 13th century. That doesn't mean that nothing interesting has happened in between, but that means that I'm trying to insist on all of the highlights that give coherence to the class that is centered around the notion of power. So the first point that we'll talk about is the fact that the center of gravity of the Anglo-Norman kingdom remains the continent. Through marriage and through conquest, the English crown under the Plantagenets, William's descendants, acquired new lands in today's France. Basically, in the 12th century, I will sum it up, and do not quote me on that, as lots of drama. Eventually you get to the English kings forcing the barons to go to war against France to defend their territories. One of the examples we could mention is the 100 Years' War. For that, you can, of course, feel free to refer to the plays by William Shakespeare, whether it be Henry IV, V, or VI, the Henriettes, as it's called. The kings imposed taxation on the barons to finance the war. And when they refused to pay the taxes, well, they jailed them. You can feel free, if you wanted, to check out the new biopic that's called The King with superstar Timothée Chalamet, tracing Henry's evolution from wayward prince to heroic warrior. This is really loosely based on the Henriette that I mentioned a second ago, Shakespeare's plays. Okay, it's just a little bit of an aside. Now, what happened is that King John was forced to sign Magna Carta by his barons and the clergy. basically the barons saw the feudal system not as the absolute power of the king, but as a sort of transactional system of reciprocal obligation between the king and the subject. So they didn't think that the king could do whatever the heck he wanted. They thought that everyone had duties, and this was a relationship, in other words. So they accused the king of tyranny, and they rebelled, like, you're not abiding by those tacit rules. So King John was forced to sign Magna Carta. Magna Carta is basically one way of saying the Great Charter of Liberties. Magna is the Great and Carta is the Charter. The key points to remember, summing it up for ourselves. Number one, it limited the power of the king, especially his powers of taxation, because if you remember, that was one of the key problems in the first place. It also stated that no free man, it's important to remember that free man is a quote and not the notion of free man. And no free man was to be imprisoned except by lawful judgments by the laws of the lands. That's the notion of habeas corpus, which is defense against arbitrary judgments. Number three, something that is key to remember is that Magna Carta is considered as a precedent in modern political practice. That's what inspired the no taxation without representation in 18th century America, for example. Wow, this is all good. This is all well, but in spite of the great legend of Robin Hood fighting against King John, free men were actually landowners, and landowners were actually only 10%, not of the population, but 10% of the male population. So, what does it mean? The barons did fight to preserve their own power and privileges. They did not fight for the principle of universal freedom. In no way was it what it was about, despite the symbol that it has become now. This takes us to one other highlight that I want you to remember, which is the question of model parliament. Perhaps what you're wondering at this point is why it is called model parliament. Why is it a model for parliaments until today? Well, King John and his successors basically, well, there was Magna Carta, and then they sort of ignored Magna Carta. Magna Carta had to be reissued quite a few times. So they sort of kind of ignored it to begin with, and there were more conflicts that arose between the king and their barons. And it's basically only with Edward I and his model parliament in 1295 that the practice for the king to call parliaments, in French convoquer, on a regular basis, it's only with him that this practice became institutionalized. Now, the peculiarity of the English parliament was that, unlike the French parlement, it was a national parliament, not a regional, not a local body. So it was a larger scale, national scale. And it not only gave counsel to the king, as before, but it could also hold him to account for his actions and decisions. And you see how that is key. The introduction of such a system at such an early age in history explains why later historians have described the English Parliament as the mother of all parliaments, the mother of all parliaments. So we go from a talking chamber, a parlement, a talking chamber, the idea of the parlement, the origin of the world, not the world, to a powerhouse where the king's taxes were voted by the country's elites. So we have something that is not a regional, but a national parliament in Westminster, in London, that later on became bicameral. What it means is that it had two chambers or two houses. Now, Parliament mirrored the social order, and all right, social order in one word. I think this is sort of a slight bizarre display of the PowerPoint, but of course it's the social order. So Parliament mirrored the social order. It was the king who called and dismissed Parliament at will. You have, of course, On the one hand, the lords, of course, because we've discussed them already, you remember how important they were in the pyramid. It underlined that the king did not rely on a very large administration, but on the titled nobility. Indeed, this titled nobility that I'm referring to was basically a maximum of 60 families who inherited their lands and their titles. They were called the peers of the realm, and they were sitting by birthright in the House of Lords. So the reason why you could sit in the House of Lords is that because you'd been born as a certain person with that right to sit in the House of Lords. Hence the notion of birthright. Only the monarch could create peerages. To be given a peerage means that you become être anobli in French. You had the lords on the one hand. What else could we mention? Of course, the clergy. The clergy, well, remember that, or just learn and discover, that's no problem, that the British Isles became Christian in the 7th century. It was the richest social group in the country. And those at the top of the church, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, sat in the House of Lords as the Lords Spiritual. Now we've mentioned the lords, we've mentioned the gentry, let's move on to the gentry. So we've mentioned the lords and the clergy, right, if you're following. The gentry refers to basically the lowest orders of the untitled nobility, a group that was specific to England. So you have about 6,000 to 9,000 gentlemen and knights who owned lands. These were the town merchants. They were increasingly rich thanks to cloth industry in particular, but not only, and they governed the cities through something called corporations. Just remember, gentry, lowest orders of the entitled nobility. Both voted for and were elected to the House of Commons as members of Parliament. So remember, we talked about the House of Lords, the idea of being a member by birthright. Here, we are referring to the House of Commons with votes and elections. This is because the Crown increasingly relied on them, the monarch increasingly relied on them, in order to administer justice, levy taxation, enforce the law, and train soldiers in case there was a war. So they were important. But MPs were elected by only about 10% of the male population who had the franchise, le droit de vote. So only about 10% of the male population. The so-called freemen that we mentioned earlier on. 90% of the population was the peasantry, rural workers. That 90% could be subdivided into 75% of serfs and villeins, forced labor basically, and 25% of wage laborers, those who earned a salary in exchange for their work. So only a quarter who earned a salary. They had no political power and they were often not allowed to leave their villages. So for them, Parliament, the courts, the whole thing was like, what? That was a distant reality for them. That was not something that would have played a part in their everyday reality. At the time there was some technological progress with the windmill and the watermill. If you need to look up some of the words, once again, feel free to pause the video so that you can double check the meaning of what I am saying. Don't spend too long on it. Use the forum if you've got questions. But make sure that there is no keyword that remains unknown. Windmill, watermill, the development of trades with market towns. Trade, however, was mainly local, regional, owing to poor road connections, because if you want trade on a larger scale, then you need to bring the goods to those distant places. People would have a very, very rudimentary education, generally speaking. The everyday reality was one of famine. The everyday reality was one of disease. And the everyday reality was war. I realize that this is not a feel-good slide, but it's only getting worse. because now we're discussing the social consequences of the Black Death. A plague epidemic that came from the East. There were 7 further outbreaks after the one that I'm going to be discussing in the lecture in the next 50 years. And half the English population was decimated. This is like the worst slide in the whole of this lecture, so don't worry too much about it. But I could move on to the next slide. Point number 1. Oh, sorry. Skipping a little bit too fast. Point number 1, labor forces became very scarce. Well, because, you know, people were dying from the plague, so there weren't many people to work. Peasants are now at an advantage, were now at an advantage to ask for their lords so that they could get an improvement of their living conditions, because there aren't many people who can do the job they're doing, so they've got a good bargaining position. Serfs and villains demanded wages instead of forced labor. In 1 century, there was the systematization of wage labor and of feudal servitude. Wage laborers demanded a pay increase. So those who didn't get any wages, ceux qui n'avaient pas de salaire, ont demandé à avoir un salaire. Et ceux qui avaient un salaire, les 25% dont on a parlé tout à l'heure à peu près, on demandait à avoir une augmentation de salaire. When opposed, they became rebellious. They said, like, what the hell, you know, give me what I want, because you don't have much of a choice. I don't see people lining up to be employed. So when opposed, they became rebellious, and they left their villages and worked for other lords, even though they didn't necessarily have permission to do that, but they were in a good position to just take that permission. The nobles and the king therefore feared the collapse of the feudal system. They feared that everything might just come crashing down. Hence, an ordinance of laborers that forced them to accept the wages that existed before the plague and to keep working for their lords. So basically what you've got is this clash between the two, in other words. There was also the question of the poll tax that's infamous throughout the ages. Poll being a word for head, so the poll tax, the poor and the rich paid the same, because it was paid if you had a head, basically. It was imposed to finance the 100 Years' War. Don't need to remember the details of it, but what I want you to remember is that there was a peasants' revolt because of the tensions that were building up in the wake of these decisions. Peasants' revolt against the 14-year-old Richard II. The peasants were demanding a sort of Magna Carta for the common people. What happened is that the peasants' revolt failed, but it's important to understand that the power of the people had shown itself, that they were in a way flexing their muscles, as I'm illustrating pretty well, I think, on screen. Tyler was a leader of the revolt, so you don't necessarily need to remember his name, but his story is interesting. He managed to ride 30 yards during this uprising before he fell from his horse. In the disorder that followed, he was taken to a hospital for the poor, but he was tracked down by the mayor, he was brought back, and was publicly decapitated. So when I said that you shouldn't lose your heads, what I meant was that really you shouldn't lose your head. Tyler's head actually was placed on top of a pole, and it was carried throughout the city, and then it was displayed in London Bridge. Right, let's forget about this and move on, perhaps. Many in the gentry adapted. They poached other man's laborers, recruited other man's laborers rather than manage their lands themselves. They leased large parts to tenant farmers. Lease is like louer. It's like give someone the possibility to handle those lands. So those were the tenant farmers. Some tenant farmers got rich actually, and they became independent, land-owning free men, the yeoman. Some married into the gentry and accumulated new land. So what you've got basically, and what you need to remember, is that you've got new trading, new financing opportunities with the wealthier towns, leading to the commercialization of agricultural outputs. You've got larger lands, and then you can actually grow more and then commercialize it. In other words, what I'm describing is basically the beginnings of agricultural capitalism. So we witness a restructuring of social relations in the wake of the plague. That is something you need to remember. Restructuring of social relations with the possibility of economic mobility, climbing up the social ladder, and in some cases, even emancipation. Yet, rank, hierarchy, privileges inherited by birthright survived. They did not disappear. You also had the emerging prospect of capitalist accumulation, the rise of individualism that will lead later on to a much greater concentration of wealth in the hands of a few in the near future. So that's something for us to discuss in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Okay, the good news is that we're getting closer to the ends, because now we're on to the conclusion. What do we learn from this? Norman conquest and feudal system led to an increase of territorial and personal power for English kings. But you remember, no absolute power, because power was counterbalanced by the social elites in feudalism. Magna Carta on the one hand, 1215, modern parliament on the other hand, 1295. But the feudal order, the feudal social order, started collapsing at the end of the Middle Ages with the emergence of agricultural capitalism. England was gradually becoming a state with institutions, with an administration, as opposed, remember, to that fragmented reality of clans before the feudal system. So England was gradually becoming a state. For example, we see some of its institutions like monarchy, parliament, but that doesn't mean that it had become a nation. What do we mean by that, becoming a nation? We're talking about a feeling of belonging to the same community, to the same group, a feeling of belonging to this group, of sharing the same language, of sharing the same values, of sharing the same identity, whatever that entails, whatever that means. Right, going back to England, once we've defined that, we noticed that everyday reality was local at best or regional. There was no identification to a wider group of people before the 16th century. So the notion of a nation will come, but it's not quite there yet. Now, if you want to learn more about this subject, you can of course rewatch the video. You can of course take a look at the chapters in Mioch that are entitled 1066, and the one about Magna Carta as well, and then another one 1337 to 1453. What do we learn from this? What are the key events? What are the key people? What are the key dates, the key ideas or concepts, and the key places? What I want you to do once you've watched this particular lecture is list those things. Feel free to share them with friends. Feel free to share them with me if you're wondering whether you've gotten the right thing. What are the key events? What are the key people? What are the key dates? What should I remember? What do we learn? What did we learn? To avoid looking at somebody in an exam, as you can see on screen, with that troubled face, thinking, when did we learn this? Well, when is during the first lecture. And that's it for today, folks. Take care of yourselves, and we should be seeing each other in real life in the tutorials, but in any case, whether we can see you all the time or not, remember that we are there for you, and that we are there for any questions related to the lecture that you may have. And once you get to meet your tutorial professors, feel free to ask them questions. If there are questions on the lecture, they'll be fine as well. Take care of yourselves.
That's all, folks.